All right, we'll see how this goes because I'm not getting very good cell phone reception here. So this may end up being a choppy live stream. We'll see. I titled this video a big one. In my mind, this is the biggest one. I'm not going to say this was the best president of the United States, but it would be hard to argue that there was another one that was more important and more impactful. In my world, if you're having a discussion of the most impactful or most important people in American history, I think this guy would have to be on the short list. That's such a nebulous topic that I'm not sure you can really pinpoint one or even a Mount Rushmore of them. But if you're having the discussion about the most important or the most impactful Americans in American history, this guy has to be on the list. I am in Hyde Park, New York. I am standing in front of the grave of our 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You can't go any farther because there's a chain, but this is the grave of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor. I'll try and talk a little bit about her because she's damn near as important as he is. Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in the 1932 election. He served as president from 1933 to 1945. Yes, you heard that right. He was elected 4 different times. He was elected in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. This guy here is why we have a constitutional amendment saying that the president can only be elected for 2 terms. He had a lot of reasons for running for president so many times. 32 and 36 were just, 40 and 44. 44 was because he wanted to see out the end of World War II. He was our president through the vast majority of World War II. He was the president through the vast majority of the Great Depression. I don't think it can be argued that another president did as much as Franklin Roosevelt, partially because he was president for so long. He was governor of New York. He was, I believe he was the Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, something like that. But he was a naval guy, which is ironic because at the age of 39 in 1921, Franklin Roosevelt got polio and was paralyzed from the waist down from the age of 39 on. Let's switch the phone here. And as somebody who's had a little bit of experience with polio, you can get polio. I'll stand with the grave behind me. You can get polio and not have it affect you too badly. Or you can get polio and it'll fuck you up hardcore. It fucked my mom up pretty good. It fucked my Aunt Hope up pretty good. And it fucked Franklin Roosevelt up pretty good. From the age of 39 onward, Franklin Roosevelt was unable to walk unaided. In the 1930s, 1920s, and 1930s, he got polio in 1921. In the 1920s and 1930s, and really into the 60s and 70s, people with polio were people with physical deformities, physical handicaps, were kind of looked down on. They were, I don't want to go second-class citizens, but they were definitely not looked at as competent members of society necessarily. Everyone knew that Franklin Roosevelt had polio, but Franklin Roosevelt took great pains to mask how paralyzed he was. He learned how to walk with braces. He had this technique where the brace would lock, like the knee brace would lock. And he would fling his foot out, and he walked with a cane, but he would fling his leg out, kind of lock the brace. He'd kind of swing his hip and lock the brace and land on it. And the brace would catch him, and then he would do the same thing with the other one and lock that one. And he walked usually with a cane and holding on to somebody, often his son. I think his son's name was Elliot. They had worked out this routine, and he had a couple of assistants and aides and things who had worked out this whole routine where he would seem to walk. Franklin Roosevelt could not walk on his own. His legs were completely useless. In private, he used a wheelchair. He had a car modified that he could drive with hand controls, which was not really a thing in the 30s, but when you're the president. But Franklin Roosevelt made the most changes to our country of any president ever. Flip back to the grave. Franklin Roosevelt made the most changes to our country of any president ever. Almost all the stuff you think about today, government program-wise, were, if not started by Franklin Roosevelt, at least proposed by Franklin Roosevelt. When he came to office in 1932, or 33, I guess, he was elected in 32, was inaugurated. He was also the last president to be inaugurated in March. I don't remember what an amendment it was, but in 1937, an amendment was passed making Inauguration Day January 20th. And so Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in March for his first two runs, right? Yeah, his first 2 runs. But after that, inauguration was January 20th. But Franklin Roosevelt served in a presidency. He came to the presidency in the middle of the Great Depression. And one of the things that he was elected for, and he was a landslide. I mean, he whipped Hoover's ass. He whipped everyone's ass. He never won a presidential election by less than 9 points. He won 1936, like 500 to 12. The only, I forget the guy's name who ran against him. Landon, I believe his name was. The only states he won were Maine and Vermont. And Roosevelt won all the rest in 1936. But Roosevelt ran on a campaign of breaking out of the Depression. And his way of breaking out of the Depression was to basically have the federal government hire everybody. And federal government to basically prop up the economy. Didn't work real good. I mean, some signs of recovery had started by 1936. Otherwise, he wouldn't have whipped so much ass in the 1936 election. But the real thing that ended the Great Depression was World War II. You got to spend money to build bombs and build boats and build tanks and pay soldiers. So he was the president through World War II. He led the country to a victory in World War II. I mean, it's hard to argue with what the man accomplished. You can make arguments about whether or not some of his programs were overly socialist. Some of the programs he instituted are still around today, and are hardcore parts of these programs he proposed, things like Social Security, Medicare. He instituted all sorts of like projects and administrations during his presidency to put people to work. The Tennessee Valley Authority is one of the biggest and most commonly known examples of that. He also, I forget what it was called, but he instituted a program in the mid-30s to put out of work journalists and writers back to work. And he hired a bunch of them to go around. At that point in the 30s, there were still quite a few former slaves from before the Civil War alive. They were getting old, and he sent people around to interview them. And there's several research studies and books have been written about the results of those interviews and publication of those interviews with former slaves, telling what it was like to be a slave in 1855. Pretty interesting reading some of those interviews. Kind of puts a little flesh on that skeleton. He was just I mean, if you look at America in 1930 and then look at America again in 1950, probably the most, what's the word I want to use? Dynamic? Impactful? I don't know what the word is. But if you look at America in 1930 and then look at America again in 1950, it's almost like they're two different damn countries. And Roosevelt had a lot to do with that. Now, also the war had a lot to do with that. But Roosevelt had an awful lot to do with that. And he was at the wheel for most of those 20 years. And you can, there's all kinds of things you can say about the guy that are negative. I called Warren G. Harding a man whore. Franklin Roosevelt was the man whore of all man whores. There wasn't a woman alive he wouldn't take a shot at. He had several affairs. Almost any female who worked for him also worked for him, if you know what I mean. him and his wife, Eleanor, and she's buried here. I'm going to talk about her a little bit, too, because she was something else in her own right. Him and his wife, after his affairs, I want to say he had his first affair in 1918? Something like that. He was born in 1882. 82, 92, 02. I think he got married in... Actually, no, I think she found out in 1918. And he started having the affair like 1914. Like, he was married like less than a year, I think, when he started having an affair with his secretary. And actually, when he died in 1945, he was in the presence of one of his mistresses. Most of their marriage, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had a business relationship. She kind of was like, all right, you just go bang whoever you want. I'm going to go do my thing, and we'll come together for photo ops and public appearances. And, you know, when I need your help with something, I'm going to let you know and you'll do it. And that's how we're going to do this. They didn't really interact much at all during their marriage. She was a very, I guess I'll call her a supportive wife, although she was not always around. But anytime he needed, you know, his wife on his arm for a photo op, she was there. And she got a lot out of the relationship, too. She was able to do a lot of things that she wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. They were, I think they were like third cousins or fourth cousins, something like that. When they got married, she didn't have to change her last name. Her last name was already Roosevelt. She was a niece of Theodore Roosevelt, who was like a uncle 5 times removed or something to Franklin Roosevelt. They were related, but relatively distantly enough that it didn't raise a lot of eyebrows when they got married. But he was definitely not faithful. He was, I mean, philanderer isn't a strong enough term to describe Franklin Roosevelt as a husband. But yeah, he was one of the most, he usually falls somewhere in the top 10 of most presidential rankings. There are people who don't like a lot of what he did. There are most of the people, especially this far out. I mean, you're looking at 100 years getting on. We're getting close to 100 years since he was president. And a lot of the things he did are still around today. And a lot of the ideas he proposed are kind of common sense today. So I think that history has proven Franklin Roosevelt to be relatively good at his job. I don't know if I'd put him top 5, maybe top 10. He appears on most top 10 presidents lists. If you're making a list of all the presidents, he's usually somewhere in the top 10 by historians. There's going to be people, he was the worst one ever, he was a socialist, he was a communist, blah, blah, blah. He wasn't any of those things. But there are people that will put him down low, but I think most of the people who would put him down low either underestimate his impact, just his flat-out impact, whether good or bad. I mean, you can say it's good or bad, I suppose, but you can't deny that he left this country a lot different than he found it, partially because he had 12 years to do it. His wife, Eleanor, who's also buried here, she spent most of her life supporting him and making him look good. After he died, though, Eleanor Roosevelt became one of the most, I'm going to say well-known, I was going to say popular, well-known activists this country has ever seen. She died in 1962, so that's what, 17 years? Over those 17 years, that woman supported more causes than probably definitely any first lady. I can't think of a first lady who accomplished more than Eleanor Roosevelt, especially after her husband died. When the UN was formed in 1946, I guess, was the first UN. Harry S. Truman appointed Eleanor Roosevelt as the first American, they called them delegates then, a first American ambassador to the UN. She was on the board of several charitable organizations. She lent her voice extensively to every civil rights cause anybody asked her to help with. She was on the board of various charitable foundations. She was very, very involved in trying to make life better. And she died in 1962, but right up until she died, she was a powerhouse. After he died, she really spent, and which is kind of the thing the wife did back then. She spent most of her time either staying out of the way, and and helping him when he needed help in his career and what he was trying to do. But they were not a happy couple. That was not a happy marriage. That was not a successful marriage. They had a couple of 3 kids, I believe, 3 or 4 kids. But it was not a happy marriage. She didn't spend any time with him. In 1944, when he was very sick and he was doing his last campaign for president, he asked her to come live with him, and she told him no. She says, "No, I'm done with you." And she was, like I said, she was not there when he died. One of his mistresses was. The lady's name was Lucy Mercer. She was his secretary for a while, and they had a 20-something year affair. And he had several other affairs in the middle of that. But there was an understanding with reporters. You didn't cover the other women, and you didn't cover the polio. There's a whole. If you're ever in Hyde Park, you should come see. Springwood, it's called. It's his family estate, and there's a museum, and you can tour his house. They have 130,000 pictures here, they said, that are taken of him at various points of his life and career. They have 4 of them taken of him in a wheelchair. And none of those pictures were taken by reporters. One was taken by a niece, one was taken by a friend, one was taken, I think, by Eleanor. I think one was taken by like a soldier or a sailor on a naval vessel that he was traveling on. So it just wasn't covered. Him having polio just wasn't covered. Everybody knew he had polio, but nobody knew the extent of it. Knew the extent of how paralyzed he was after his polio. And no one knew the extent of how dysfunctional and not married he was, even though he was married. That was not a functional marriage. So anyway, that is, I don't know how long I'm at. Like I said, I figured this video was going to take longer. Franklin Roosevelt was a complicated guy. His legacy is complicated. His presidency is complicated. He did a lot of good. You can't lead a country through World War II and not be doing some good things. He did some things that, you got to kind of go, dude. I mean, really? I don't even know if they know for sure how many mistresses he had. It's just a serial adulterer. But on the whole, I think, history has shown, people who, do this for a living and who research this and who've done their homework almost always put him in the top 10, usually, of presidents. And I think it is hard to say, good or bad. It would be hard to come up with a president who did more, who had a greater impact on the country. Again, partially because he had 12 years to do it, but also partially because he just did. So anyway, this is the grave of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in Hyde Park, New York. President from 1933 to 1945. Led the country through World War II, led the country through the Great Depression, and like I said, did more, whether you approve of it or not, did more probably than any president we've ever had.